The damp paper rustled in the silence of the kitchen, as if the house itself refused to accept the words of strangers. The ink smudged because the coals in the hearth had long since cooled and the air was damp. The signatures trembled, not from the cold, but because on the other side of the table, someone was already holding the keys and the bill for dinner. Above the black rim of the inkwell lay a thin seal taken from the door of the dowry chest. It was pressed onto the sheet, as if trying to melt the wax into law. On the shelf was an apothecary's bottle of vinegar, which the mistress usually used to wipe the table, and next to it was a 2-part candle. In the corner was a wooden laundry tub smelling of lye. Outside the windows, the city bustled with its usual daytime market, and only this lent reality to a situation in which marriage had suddenly become a matter of clerical ingenuity, and the body an item on a list. The narrator, in a male voice, greets the listeners and reminds them that he is happy to see everyone who has tuned into this analysis. He asks them to write in the comments where they are watching from, which city, which country, and wishes them pleasant listening, because ahead lies a story where myths about family power will be shattered by documents, and the documents will be read as they were read by city clerks and notaries, whose books smelled of wax, dried leather bindings, and the fear of losing face in front of the community. The city in question lived under Magdeburg law. Its market stretched from the town hall to the Dominican courtyard, and on the outskirts, slaughterhouses drained into a moat, reminding us that blood in this place was not a metaphor, but a craft. On the throne of the crown, under whose authority the magistrate ruled, sat a ruler known to his contemporaries as Sigismund de Fognes, and his chancellery was far away. But in every district there were statutes that the town hall clerks knew by heart. Marriage cases here were conducted between the bench of the city merchants and the parish house, where promises, oaths, and dowry records were registered. The penalty books neatly listed the punishments for noisy scandals, insults, assault, and disturbing the peace during evening prayers. Next to them were estimates of the value of furniture, cloth, grain, and pigs. Among all this, there was nothing that the husband had tried to bring to the notary's office. A sheet of paper entitled Full Power of Attorney for Family Decisions, including what clerks referred to as matters of the marital bed, but which were never officially named as objects of alienation. The reason was a scene common to the artisan outskirts. The family of a tanner, who lived near the bridge over the stream where hides were tanned, argued about expenses, debts, and who should decide when and how the mistress of the house should yield to demands that were called a duty in neighboring houses and mutual consent in canonical collections. The husband thought it logical to put sole authority on paper. If he was responsible for the workshop and for paying the guild, if he paid the city tax and kept the house in order, then the right to make decisions about his wife's life should, in his view, also be his alone. He brought a sheet of paper, drawn up by a local freelance scribe, to the notary and asked him to certify it with a seal. The sheet bore his wife's signature, made at home rather than in the office, and traces of the seal from her dowry. The notary saw this and the slanted pressure of the pen and asked for an explanation. The husband replied that the paper was for peace and order, as was customary in his family. The investigation began not with emotions, but with a comparison of forms. The city notary kept collections of sample marriage contracts on his shelf. There were records of dowries, widows' shares, wills, the transfer of movable property as collateral, the allocation of part of the shop to the son, the wife's right to the key to the chest, how to calculate fabric and silver in the division if the family fell into debt. In those samples, copied from ancient translations of the decretals and city customary law books, there was no clause where consent to intimacy or refusal of it would be transferred as a thing, as a permanent right in favor of one person. The scribe emphasized that contracts concerned property, debts, and labor, but not the body. And if marriages were recognized by mutual consent, then consent did not turn into a servitude that could be ceded or sold. This logic goes back to the canons, which were copied from ancient collections in textbooks for young clerics. Marriage exists when two people give mutual consent. There is no paper that makes this consent a perpetual obligation, like a lease or a tax obligation. As the notary leafed through and checked the documents, details began to emerge. The district elder had already visited the tanner's house. Neighbors complained about the noise and shouting that could be heard late at night. The book of fines already contained one entry with the amount of the penalty for disturbing the peace at night, and another for insulting his wife in front of witnesses. A few months earlier, the parish records had noted a confession in which the priest had made a note about family instruction, mentioning the consent of the spouses. The note was dry and without details, as befits a cantor's notes, but its presence meant that the conversation about boundaries had already taken place. Added to these lines was the smell of a tanning pit. There were apprentices in the house, they lived in an annex, and the community knew that such houses were places where the master's authority easily turned into shouting and then into complaints. The wife's sister and cousin from the neighboring yard lived nearby. They would later bring 2 more sheets, written by the same freelance scribe, with the same words about full authority over family decisions, only the signatures were more even because they were made under the supervision of the husband's relatives and by candlelight in the godparents' house. This would prove to be a turning point. It would become apparent that this form was not a random excess of one household, but part of a smaller tradition supported by relatives for the sake of demonstrating power and sometimes for the sake of control over the dowry. The myth of absolute family power in this neighborhood was maintained not by texts, but by habit. The older men repeated that order meant one person being responsible for everyone. The women kept the keys, but the key to the door was considered a symbol of modesty, not of power. However, the city had a different logic. The magistrate, whose clerks sat under the coat of arms and listened to cases, dealt with what could be measured, evaluated, and recorded. For him, power meant fines, payment deadlines, lengths of cloth, measures of grain, lists of tools. When a paper was brought in, claiming alienation of consent, it stood out from the rest, like a bad hide from a batch. In the office, they sensed this instinctively. As soon as the case concerned the body, the language of the business books became clumsy, because there were no headings or stamps. This silence of the book is also a document. When there is no column, it means that something cannot be turned into a thing. Next came the dry mechanics of city procedure. The notary refused to immediately certify the document and summoned witnesses to verify the voluntariness of the signature. At the same time, he compared the wording with marriage contracts from other neighborhoods. Weavers, bakers, gunsmiths. Everywhere it was the same. A dowry that no one had access to without the key holder. Penalty clauses in case of debt. Sometimes a condition of temporary residence with parents. Nowhere was there anything about the transfer of the right to consent. And if there were any references to marital obligations, they had no legal force in the form of an alienable right. The Chancellery noted that church teachings reiterated the idea of reciprocity. City statutes emphasized moderation, and community judges practiced restraint of violence. A comparison of these 3 lines gave rise to an absolute rule. It is impossible to write down on paper what, by its very nature, requires living consent each time. Meanwhile, economics came to the fore. The power of attorney that the husband wanted to legalize was not only about customs. It protected a scheme in which the dowry was gradually transferred to the workshop's turnover, and the mistress's refusal to give the key without dispute became a violation of family peace. The chest contained canvases, silver spoons, a pair of bracelets, 2 wax ingots, and scraps of expensive wool. all of which were listed in the dowry inventory as personal property. If the paper turned the keykeeper into a manual appendage of the common authority, then the chest became part of the workshop to the extent that the division of debts changed the proportions in favor of the husband's family. This was the silent meaning of the sheet, not only about the body, but also about the metal, fabric, and candles that could be sold. The freelance clerk who drew up such sheets was paid by the husband's side. His name appeared in 3 other papers from neighboring parishes. Thus, a family dispute gave rise to a network of texts sealed with wax and fear. The pressure of the clan was felt in everything, in the way neighbors talked about meetings at the tavern at the end of the street, where the elders discussed discipline in their homes, in the way girls were looked at the fair, their dowries being assessed before marriage, in how the neighborhood headman informed the notary that any attempts to investigate such matters caused irritation among the craftsmen. This irritated background was older than any sheet of paper with a seal. But it was no coincidence that the shopkeeper's report from previous years included a record of a fine imposed on one of the relatives for forcing his wife to leave for the village against her will. At that time, the magistrate had already determined that family authority did not override civil rules. This precedent did not concern the intimate aspects of life, but it showed the boundary. One cannot drive a person out of the city under the guise of domestic order. Now the question was deeper. Is it possible to drive the will out of the body under the guise of the same rhetoric? The medical side of that era was rough and sober. The Franciscan court's infirmary kept herbs for insomnia, powders for fever, and ointments for bruises. Midwives kept their notebooks, noting outcomes, time, fever, and weakness. When scandals occurred in homes, after which women came for painkillers, it was evident from the queues at the pharmacists. The notary, not being a doctor, saw this as a social symptom. The pressure at home was not hidden. This resulted in special statistics, not in numbers, but in impressions. In such and such months, complaints intensified. Then parish records made notes about orders to keep the peace. Then shopkeepers collected more cases about nighttime silence. This was not science in the modern sense. It was the keen observation of a clerical hand that had looked people in the eye for 20 years in a row when they brought their papers. When the notary gathered the witnesses, he got a fragmented picture. The apprentice mentioned that the sheet was signed with the shutters closed. The neighbor said she heard an argument and then saw the mistress go out into the churchyard, where women usually stood seeking advice. The priest reported that he had already told the family that coercion was a sin and a violation of peace, not a duty. The husband's family, represented by his cousin, insisted that these were the customs of the family. 2 others brought similar papers from their homes, as if the number of sheets could in itself be an argument. All this looked like an attempt to invent a quasi-law. When something is repeated often enough and pretended to be the norm, a dangerous illusion of law arises. It is at such moments that books of statutes and collections of forms are important. They prevent habit from being called law. Another prepared twist fit into this move. An old collection of forms from another city, where they once tried to enshrine in a marriage contract the obligation of a wife to live in her father-in-law's house, was abolished at the time with the proviso that personal residence is regulated by mutual benefit, not by family claims. This text, rewritten at the end of the century by a bookbinder, lay on the notary's shelf. It showed how dangerous it is to turn family customs into an immutable rule for the body. It contained a subtle idea of the era. A home may be necessary, but not as a cage, but as a place where people live by mutual consent. This document, along with the canonical principle of reciprocity and city fines for violence, gave rise to formal arguments that would later be developed by the lawyers when the case came to trial. And although there were no criminal charges here, there was an attempt to create a text shackle that pretended to be a contract. This whole machine of societies, church, city, family, ran on the power that fear, money, and reputation gave it. Reputation in the neighborhood was valued as highly as good leather belts. It withstood the strain of debts and the glances of neighbors. Men thought that a sheet of paper with a seal would keep the house from falling apart. Women thought that the key at their belt and the records of their dowry were the only solid ground. The notary, who had wax seals, books of forms, and complaints about nighttime noise on his desk, saw it as a web of misunderstandings, where it was easy to tie a new knot, but to untie it required precision and memory of the text. When he said that he would not approve the paper immediately, he was not relying on emotion, but on the absence of indexes and graphs. There is no right to alienate consent. There is no mechanism for the permanent transfer of will from one to another. So there is no seal for such a sheet. So the introduction to the case will end with a whole stack of papers on the table instead of a single sheet. Marriage forms from different workshops, city statutes, parish reminders, records of fines, midwives' notes about women coming in after nighttime quarrels, as well as 3 documents with identical wording from the circle of relatives. And among this mass of paper, it is not the wax seal or the neat handwriting of a private practitioner that will have the strongest effect, but the emptiness in the collections, the place where there has never been and should never be a line stating that consent can be given in advance and forever to someone as the key to a chest. This emptiness is the limit, the invisible boundary that was felt in the cities under the Crown's rule, as clearly as the neighborhood guards felt when their right to enter a house without witnesses ended. And no matter how much the family insisted on its tradition, the city responded with silence, behind which stood a simple idea. The body is not turned into a thing because a thing is not asked every time. From this limit, the countdown began. A thread was attached to the case, and it pulled the knots along with it. The clerical hand, accustomed to calculating grain and skins, now added up not only prices and deadlines, but also human fatigue. The parish books noted that the leatherworker's wife began to visit the chapel more often on weekdays. The apothecary's notebook recorded increased sales of poppy seed tincture. The district elder's book added another line about noise. These scattered clues revealed something important. The letter, pretending to be orderly, was in fact about pressure. And when the town hall set a date for the hearing, it didn't sound like a big deal, but more like the tap of a wooden hammer on the edge of a table, a familiar sign that fear and pain had taken their place among the usual matters of measuring salt and rights to toolboxes. The first layer was marriage contracts. The matchmakers asked for lists with samples from different workshops to be brought to the table so that they could be placed side by side. The clerk carefully laid them out. For weavers, the husband's obligation not to sell the loom without his wife's consent. For bakers, the rule that the night oven could not be mortgaged without the wife's personal property as collateral. For blacksmiths, a clause on the joint storage of keys to the coal warehouse in case of large debts. For merchants, a clause on a separate bag for small transactions. Each example reflected an understanding of authority as a responsibility rather than a right over another person's body. On top of these papers lay a collection of church instructions where the section on marriage repeated the idea of consent requiring reciprocity every time, a formula copied from ancient decretal glosses, albeit in a language understandable only to scholars. The notary translated it for himself into a dry, everyday meaning. A living response cannot be turned into a permanent obligation by a written document, because a living response is based on physical condition, health, state of mind, and seasonal workload. The second layer was economics. Between the lines of the papers, profit could be read. The dowry, described in the marriage contract as personal, was gradually being put into circulation in the tanner's workshop. A pair of silver spoons had already been taken to the pawn shop and redeemed a month later. The fabric was sold to pay for lime and bark. The wax from the chest was used to make candles for the guild meeting. These actions were not crimes in themselves. The house was held together by mutual support. But the power of attorney that they were trying to legalize turned temporary assistance into a permanent right. The key-keeper, from being the bearer of her own will, became a silent part of the workshop. When the shopkeepers asked for the accounting records to be brought out, it turned out that in 2 neighboring houses with similar documents, the wife's dowry had been completely transferred into circulation in 1 year, and the husband's family now claimed that this was right because there was only one house. This information became a prepared twist. The power of attorney document was not a single whim, but a mechanism for redistributing property in favor of one branch of the family, under the guise of the myth of family discipline. The third layer was the bodies and their wear and tear. The monastery infirmary reported that in recent months there had been an increase in the number of middle-aged women complaining of fatigue, headaches, aching bones, and blue circles under their eyes. Midwives noted exhaustion from constant anxiety in some of them. In a neighboring quarter, 2 women related to those who had presented similar powers of attorney asked the parish treasury for help with bread because they could not cope with household chores amid endless conflicts. An experienced doctor grumbled plaintively that there was no strong remedy for pain except sleep and rest, but rest had disappeared from these homes. The dryness of these records is not artistic exaggeration. They were written by people who measured life in spoons and glasses. And when such lines appeared next to a letter of full authority, a grim but clear perspective emerged. Using the myth of order, the clan tried to put pressure on those whose strength was weakened by work and anxiety, not stubbornness. The fourth layer was a network of notary practitioners. The name of the private practitioner who drew up the disputed power of attorney appeared in 3 other cases, those of the landlady's sister, her cousin, and a widow from another neighborhood, who, 6 months after drawing up a similar document, recorded an agreed transfer of the key to her husband for the term of the debt. The term of the debts stretched on for years. The notary collected these documents, found the same phrases, the same arrangement of symbols, and strange references to house customs written in the same hand. This opened up a second line of inquiry. There was not only a family habit, but also a small craft industry of semi-legal papers linking fears to the seal. A widow, who did not belong to the Tanner's family, brought her accounting sheets. They showed that the freelance clerk was paid not only in silver, but also with items from the dowries of the women for whom he wrote such powers of attorney. This detail, like a crooked stitch on thin leather, revealed the structure of interests. The fifth layer was the law as a public stage. Not only the parties and witnesses came to the hearing, but also craftsmen from neighboring workshops. They listened as the clerk quoted "custom of the house," and the notary placed books next to him where "custom of the city" and church rules said the opposite. And although no one spoke harsh words aloud, the tension in the room was as thick as the steam in the bathhouse. One touch of a valve and hot water would spray from every crack. The husband's family claimed through their representatives that order was more important than leniency. The merchants' representatives, accustomed to weighing risks, shook their heads cautiously because they understood the price of a precedent in which the will of one person became a commodity. The merchants reminded them that their power was limited by charter and statute, not by sympathy. The church cantor made brief notes about non-interference in civil matters, but about the obligation of mutual consent. Taken together, these positions drew a line that the clan so wanted to cross out of habit. At that moment, an unexpected benefactor appeared, not in the guise of a hero, but as a boring bill and a short note. An elderly moneylender, the widow of a cooper, owned a shop where pawns were cashed in at low interest rates. She brought 2 documents to the office. a receipt for silver spoons from the trunk of the tanner's wife, and a note in which the same private clerk entrusted the husband's relative with the return of the amount received as collateral for the dowry. This small connection between the monetary debt and the author of the disputed power of attorney gave the case an additional perspective. The power of attorney for family decisions and the transfer of items from the chest to the workshop's inventory were part of a connection between people and money, in which one justified the other. The widow did not draw moral conclusions. She simply saved her interest and brought the paper because she sensed a risk. But it was precisely this silent step that highlighted a dangerous area. The emasculation of will covers up the transfer of property, and the transfer of property covers up the spread of power of attorney as an instrument of pressure. Among the shopkeepers was an employee who had once studied with a canon lawyer in another city and loved to look for parallels. He brought to the table an old record of a dispute in the district court at the governor's court, where a complaint about forced residence with a father-in-law was being considered. There, the judges stipulated that custom could not override the basic provisions on freedom of household within the city limits, and required the consent of both parties for a long-term change of residence. This formula contained a principle that was now being transferred from geography to the body. If it is impossible to deprive someone of their home without their consent, then it is impossible to deprive them of their presence in themselves without their consent. And although the words seemed too subtle for the noisy workshop, their dry meaning sounded like a hammer in the hall. One cannot derive a rule for the bodies of the living from the silence of the ancestors, because the silence of the ancestors did not sign anything. Her husband's family did not give up. Rumors spread throughout the neighborhood that a woman who challenged the order was destroying the home. In the tavern on the corner, people discussed how it was easier for craftsmen in neighboring towns because no one interfered in their bedrooms. These conversations were not empty. A woman's reputation can collapse faster than the price of hops after a bad harvest, and the consequences for her will be worse than any fine. Added to this pressure were letters from elders stating that peace in the home was paramount. The office took a stricter formal line. No family customs could override the lack of legal form for the alienation of consent. The magistrates ordered extracts from the statutes to be printed and posted on the town hall doors for several days so that anyone who wished could see them. This gesture was intended not as information, but as a shield. When the text becomes visible, it is more difficult for rumors to be presented as law. Invisible actors, bath attendants, washers, and the Guild of Laundresses also influenced the background. The bathhouse charter, drafted a year ago, included a rule about treating female visitors with care and a ban on admitting men during women's hours, under penalty of a fine. The Book of Laundresses included a clause stating that laundresses had the right to refuse work if they were threatened in their customers' homes. These small, everyday norms reflected the city's understanding. Shame and fear are bad currency for work and health, and the community has an interest in protecting those who keep up the daily grind. When this horizon of everyday care converged with the dry columns of marriage forms and the canonical principle of reciprocity, the result was a network that kept the body in its rights without calling it property. Meanwhile, the freelance clerk began to disappear from the tavern and walk through secret courtyards. He had clients among those who loved papers with strong words. There was also dependence on people of the clan, debts, guarantees, petty blackmail. The notary did not have a habit of turning exposure into a hunt, but the collected sheets showed one thing. The language in which the clerk formalized the custom was conveyor belt speech that knew no boundaries between property and will. This is not just a mistake. It is a way of thinking about the city outside its statutes, as a continuation of the family courtyard. In such a picture, women, even adults and experienced ones, became involuntary hostages of pre-written phrases. The clerical response was both modest and strong. The clerks asked the district governor for clarification in order to support the decision with a reference to higher-level practice, and while awaiting a response, they issued a temporary ban on certifying powers of attorney with wording about the alienation of consent. Doctors, not inclined to argue about the law, noticed the effect. After the moratorium was announced, it became quieter in the pharmacy. Visits for tinctures for headaches did not disappear completely, but they became less frequent. Midwives noted that women began to come to them not to hide, but to ask how to talk to their husbands and relatives when they insisted on paper. This shift from silent suffering to seeking ways to speak up was a small but visible change. There was no romance or resounding victories in it. There was a quiet hope that the body's place in the city was indeed protected by texts. The last week before the decision dragged on, 2 members of the clan came to the tanner's house and demonstratively stayed overnight by the fire, as if their presence alone would give the furniture more weight. The hostess's sister brought her cousin and showed her papers to the notary, who asked them to leave them for verification. The moneylender brought another bill and asked the magistrate to speed up the hearing, because the longer the uncertainty lasted, the greater the risk to her collateral. There were whispers in the market that the merchants were going to set an example, a fine as a sign that the city walls were not only stone, but also a boundary for language that tries to turn the body into an object. Towards evening, the office staff leafed through books from previous years, looking for analogies so as not to invent sensational novelties, but to retrieve from the city's memory what had once held the line. By the morning of the day set for the final hearing, it was cool and damp at the town hall, like in a basement with salted barrels. People went about their business, but sharp ears caught signs. Would the town clerks come out with an announcement right away? Would they call the guild representatives inside? Would a cleric appear in the square to remind everyone to remain peaceful? Inside, everything was already prepared. A stack of marriage forms, extracts from the statutes, notes from the church cantor, records of monthly pharmacy sales, 3 disputed powers of attorney, receipts from the moneylender, a record of the fine for the previous expulsion from the city, and a letter of explanation from the district court. This letter had arrived the night before, and its meaning was crystal clear. The district recognized the limits of alienation of will within the meaning of the statute and customs, and therefore any powers of attorney that replaced living consent in matrimonial matters with a permanent transfer of rights were null and void, regardless of the number of witnesses and seals. There was no moralizing in this phrase. It sounded like a calculator. Null and void means they do not give rise to legal consequences. They do not give rise to legal consequences means they do not protect the interests of the parties relying on them. They do not protect means they are financially and socially dangerous. The husband's family was already standing in a tight group at the entrance, hoping that the crowd would make an impression. But the city is not the crowd at the door. The city is the books on the table. And when the judges opened the session, they leaned on those books as if they were stone blocks at the base of a bridge. The notary's gaze was weary but firm. He knew that a dispute over the fine would ensue, not as revenge, but as an indication of the price for attempting to turn a living will into a contractual obligation. And although the outcome had not yet been announced, the musicality of the process had already taken shape. The myth stood on the right, the paper on the left, the everyday noise of the market came through the window, and in the middle, cautiously, bit by bit, a new habit was forming, not to allow powers of attorney to masquerade as family virtue. The decision sounded like a dry account, point by point, without unnecessary embellishment, because in city affairs, it is not loudness that matters, but clarity of consequences. The disputed document was declared null and void under the terms of the statute and charter, stating that the attempt to turn consent into a timeless obligation contradicted the form of marriage as a union of two capable persons. The clause on full authority over family decisions was left without legal effect, and the appendices, which contained the words "every time" and "without exception," were noted as invalid. The husband's family was fined an amount comparable to the price of a couple of good cows, not for the dispute, but for pressuring adult women and imposing semi-legal documents through family meetings. The freelance clerk was deprived of the right to certify documents until further notice. His papers from neighboring houses were subject to review with all parties summoned. The moneylender was ordered to return the dowry-related pledges if they were obtained under disputed powers of attorney, and the parties were ordered to settle their debts as if these papers had never existed. On top of all this, the magistrate announced a temporary ban on the certification of any papers with wording about the alienation of consent in matrimonial matters until a general clarification was issued for all parishes. Thus, the myth of absolute family authority hit the granite edge of the book. Not where they shout, but where they count. Then came the days when the law became everyday life, and everyday life became a quiet reputation. Extracts were posted at the doors of the town hall. Parish clerks repeated the text of the explanation at the entrances to churches. Guilds, which supposedly had nothing to do with these words, amended their internal rules so as not to leave any loopholes. The weavers recorded that any orders regarding joint labor did not affect the personal will of spouses and could not replace it. The bakers confirmed that the night oven was a matter of common management, but not a reason for pressure at home. The bathhouse attendants clarified the hours for women and men and reiterated the ban on intrusions under penalty of a fine in favor of the city coal stall. Laundry workers were given the right to refuse work if threatened in customers' homes, with the right to appeal to the district police without intermediaries. These small, almost imperceptible changes reinforced one idea: the body and consent are not things. They cannot be passed from hand to hand like a key or a measuring cup. Life in the tanner's house did not calm down immediately. The family still maintained a dignified silence, which by neighborhood standards was louder than shouting. The men sat by the fire, like a pack, and their sitting replaced arguments. But only one end of the street sat by the fire. The other end had already heard that the silver spoons had been returned to the moneylender's stall and that the weaver's wife had bought back 2 bundles of fabric from the bench. These returns were a tangible sign, one that could be felt. And although the tension in the house had not dissipated, the mistress once again had a real key to the chest, and not a power of attorney made by someone else's hand. The pharmacy saw fewer sales of poppy seed tincture. Midwives noted that women began to ask them not for painkillers, but for advice on what words to use when people came to their homes again with persuasion and frightening phrases about peace. The freelance clerk, deprived of the right to certify new documents, found himself in the position of a craftsman without a machine. His notebooks, tied with strings, now lay in the office under inventory. In them, they found neatly recorded amounts for drawing up family trees, small debts, and most importantly, a list of pledges that included items from the dowries of women who agreed to full entrustment. This immoral accounting is an exposé. The pattern of dependence and profit ran like a thread through every line, linking family discipline with petty profiteering. At the addresses where such sheets were already in effect, the neighborhood elders went around with copies of the decision, not as punishers, but as bearers of a new habit. In 2 courtyards, women brought stools and jugs of water out onto the bench in advance. They knew that the conversation would be long, but for the first time, it would not be about the need to remain silent, but about what could be said, based on the paper. There was no celebration of victory at the town hall. They simply continued to write as they had written yesterday and the day before. Several new lines appeared in the book of fines. A fine for attempting to use threats to force the withdrawal of a complaint. A fine for spreading rumors about the fall from grace of a woman who had appealed to the magistrate. A fine with double penalties in favor of the Bathhouse Guild for a skirmish at the bathhouse door. In the accompanying notes, the shopkeepers carefully recorded that these actions were harmful to the general peace and to the working class. In the meadow outside the city gates, tanned hides were still being dried, and the smell of bark and lime was still thick. But many who passed by now knew that there were things in this city that could not be turned into commodities, even if they were stamped with a beautiful seal. The canonists sent an explanation that was understandable even to those who were not familiar with subtle words. Marriage is based on mutuality, not on the unilateral transfer of rights. Consent is an action, not a thing. The language of trust does not create what the law does not recognize. This was not the introduction of new truths, but rather a return of meaning to words that had been worn away by custom. In one of the counties, according to the Courier, they tried to object, citing the local custom of instructing wives. The answer was short. Instruction is not a command over the body, and the instructor does not receive the right to a living response from another person. This exchange of official notes reinforced the magistrate's decision, as if supports had been added to the stone arch in case of the rainy season. Meanwhile, the economic trail that originally stretched between the moneylender's stall and the dowry chests continued to unfold. In the merchant's shop, they calculated that in recent months, the turnover from exchanging household items for small change had decreased, while redemptions had accelerated. The moneylender, who counted every penny, admitted to herself that she preferred a stable city to unstable profits, where things were returned to their rightful owners. Money loved order, not scandal. She began to require customers who brought items from their dowries to show marriage certificates instead of strange powers of attorney. This private standard was not recorded in the statute, but it spread, as convenient measures spread. If you have a basket, it is more convenient to carry things in it than in your hands. The consequences were also becoming apparent from a medical point of view. The monastery doctor noted that middle-aged women had fewer complaints of insomnia and heavy heads in the evenings, which had previously followed family quarrels. Midwives noted a paradox. Talking about the law, seemingly dry and heavy, brought people more relief than tinctures and ointments. In the physical life of the city, the law worked like a doctor. It did not treat with herbs, but removed part of the irritant, which was the obsessive expectation of unquestioning duty. The word remained on people's lips, but its meaning changed. Duty now more often meant care and distribution of labor, rather than an attempt to push the body with harsh words. The husband's family quickly adapted on the outside and resisted for a long time on the inside. In taverns, people whispered that the city had become softer, that it had allowed shame to cross the threshold of private rooms. These whispers attempted to bring back the old mask. That which is public is dirty. But such words found less of an audience than words that had already lost once on paper. The masters of the workshops calculated that a fine was cheaper than a scandal, and a scandal was more expensive than silence in a night oven. Merchants figured that the market loves habit and dislikes rumors. Shopkeepers repeated that their power was not over hearts, but over forms, and they stuck to the forms. And where they used to like to apply a seal with a house pattern to the case, now they more often applied their finger to a line in the statute, as if to a mark on a measuring stick. In the neighboring streets, questions were raised about what to do with the already compiled sheets, which were not subject to signatures in the office, but remained in chests as frightening signs. A simple everyday action helped here. Neighborhood elders went from house to house, and asked women to bring such papers to shops or parish offices for destruction in the presence of witnesses. This ritual, without solemnity or preaching, seemed to remove from the air the needle on which the fabric of silence was held. Several dozen sheets were burned in bakers' ovens and town hall fireplaces, turning to ash. The ashes were taken out with the rest without being singled out or marked. No one wanted to create new symbols. The old ones had to be removed. After a brief investigation, the freelance scribe was held accountable for falsifying references to customary practice in public documents. He was not subjected to severe punishment. He was fined an amount comparable to the monthly turnover of a copy shop and was required to undergo recertification by a notary from another district. The severity was like a ruler, not for pain, but for alignment. He was given a chance to work, but no chance to repeat the old formula. And that turned out to be worse for him than if he had simply been fired. Strong words no longer worked in a market where forms, not customs, were bought. By the middle of the next season, the magistrate received news from 2 other towns. They had tried to certify similar documents, but, referring to our decision and the explanation we had sent, they refused. And although there was not a hint of gratitude in those messages, there was a quiet, important connection. If you have a bridge over a turbulent river, it is easier for your neighbor to cross, even if he slips. In our town hall, this was recorded briefly. Investigation. Not enthusiasm, not imitation, but simply following a line that has already proven its worth. The tanner's house was getting used to the new temperature. Before, it had been hot from the shouting and the tanning pits. Now it was cool from the silent tension, but at least it wasn't stuffy. Women from the family, whose papers had also been deemed worthless, began to ask the guilds for small jobs at home. Mending bags, cutting cloth, sorting leather scraps. Any work where hands were worth money, not silence. It seemed trivial, but in a city where labor is perceived as a measure, such trifles move huge stones. When your day is measured, it is more difficult for them to manipulate the words honor and order. These words become what they should be, common, not clubs. The third prepared turn, the response of the district court, went further than the shopkeepers had anticipated. The governor's office sent a collection of interpretations of the statute, with margins marked out on the limits of legal capacity in matrimonial matters. The margins were neatly filled in with a phrase about the non-transferability of consent, stating that any documentary confirmation of permanent readiness is invalid. This collection began to be copied for schools attached to cathedrals. Clerical students eagerly underlined these lines in red vermilion because they were rarely so specific. And perhaps it is precisely in this precision that the human side of the law is hidden. Sometimes people need not a general "be kinder," but a very specific "it doesn't work," no matter how you write it. My husband's family still made forays into the old ways. Several times, members of the family tried to gather a men's meeting to discuss how to live without the former fortress. At one such meeting, the district elder appeared uninvited, with a piece of parchment on which a clause from the statute on the inviolability of bodily will in marriage had been copied. He did not make any loud speeches. He simply placed the parchment on the table and remained there while the men argued about the price of salt. The silent presence of the law enforcement officer had more power than any tirade because it replaced the air in the room. This air made it harder for the moisture of habit to cling to the walls. A few months later, as measured by the dried ink on the edges of the books, the book of fines no longer contained any lines about night noises at the tanner's house. Other entries appeared, about a dispute over a place at the drying racks, about the size of the contribution to the workshop, about a marriage among the bakers, where it was necessary to calculate the share of flour in the dowry. It was a sign that what had happened had become part of everyday life. And although no one put up commemorative plaques, on market days at the town hall door, One could see a scene that had not been there before. A woman would stop to run her finger along a line of the posted statute, and a man would stand nearby and not interfere. He could be her husband, brother, or neighbor. It did not matter. What mattered was that both knew that the line was not written to scold, but so that it could be shown at any moment and said, "Here is the measure," without turning that measure into someone's club. In a city governed by Magdeburg law, people often forget that law is not only the court, but also the language in which bakers and weavers talk to shopkeepers. After the decision on the invalidity of the disputed power of attorney, this language seemed to have been cleansed of grease stains. Where words had previously been sticky and stretched out like undercooked gluten, phrases now became short and clear. They could be rewritten once, twice, 3 times, and still have the same meaning. And when a new marriage contract from the young couple was brought to the town hall in late autumn, it smelled of new parchment and fresh wax. It contained provisions about the dowry, debts, the key, and the fact that the right of consent was non-transferable. The young couple looked tired, not from fighting, but from working at the fair, and that was the best news in a long time. Life had returned to its simple standards. This inconspicuous clarity contained the most important protection. Myths love darkness. Where visibility is poor, they grow like mold in a damp basement. Documents love light. They are hung up, pointed at, copied. And when the evening lights came on in the city, and a candle was placed on each town hall bench according to tradition, people passing by saw white sheets with black lines. They promised nothing. They demanded nothing. They just lay there, accessible to the hand. This accessibility was the new habit. Not to apply a seal to the body, but to apply text to the matter. Not to turn consent into a thing, but to keep it alive, like a breath that cannot be transferred by proxy, because it always happens here and now, with a specific person, on a specific day, with specific fatigue or tenderness. And this is exactly what distinguishes a city from a courtyard, and a law from family praise. As clarity took hold in the papers, the city began to resemble a workshop, where after a long period of confusion, the tools were finally sorted into boxes, hammers with hammers, awls with awls, measuring sticks in a prominent place. The clerks understood that a single formulation would not hold the line if it was not supported by everyday life. Therefore, they spread the decision through the capillaries of the city, through study, through contracts, through small duties that change habits no worse than large fines. At the cathedral school, clerics analyzed marriage forms together with future scribes, and next to each entry about the dowry, the instructor pasted a piece of parchment with a note about the non-transferability of consent. The students copied the line without inspiration, as they copied the table of weights and measures. But that was exactly what was needed. To turn the limit not into a slogan, but into a boring norm that sticks in the mind. The guild's saving face rewrote their internal registers. The tanners introduced a rule that items from the dowry could not be put into circulation without a separate note about a voluntary temporary loan, confirmed by the key holder personally in the office and not at the home table. Merchants had a new clause stating that the pawnshop would not accept items with a marriage inventory without the presentation of a contract and the presence of the owner. Bondars were reminded that the barrel served as collateral, not the owner. These dry formulas were like marks on the stones of a coastal ford. In the dark, you could stumble over them, but on a clear day they led you straight. No one called it a concern for honor. Everyone called it accounting. And it was the language of accounting that proved stronger than loud words about tradition, because it answers the question of who is responsible with their head and wallet, and when. A counterwave appeared on the horizon. In a neighboring district, several houses from the same clan attempted to return to the old scheme, bringing new letters with more cunning twists. These letters avoided direct references to kinship but prescribed the transfer of the right to make family decisions in full upon the onset of duties. The formula was polished to a government-approved shine, but the meaning remained the same. The matchmakers asked for copies to be sent. Clerks tapped their pens and compared the turns of phrase, as if checking patterns on counterfeit stamps. The placement of the conjunctions matched. The unusual word combinations matched. Even the manner of putting the final flourish matched. The hand was the same, only it was writing on new paper. This coincidence became another brick in the wall. The case was no longer a family matter and became a question of order in general. How to deal with private forgeries of public measures. The notary, already known for his stubborn love of formulas, suggested a simple remedy. Create an identifying mark for powers of attorney relating to property, labor, and debts so that they would not be confused with anything else. The office cut out small lead seals bearing the office's mark. The seals were attached to the document with a cord, and a note about the subject of the power of attorney appeared in the register next to it. If someone brought a sheet without a seal, but with a claim to validity, they were sent to the ledger. This trick proved surprisingly effective. It was easier for people to distinguish between types of papers with their eyes than to catch the subtleties by ear. And when another independent practitioner stuck a neat scroll into the office window and there was no seal on it, he was met with an empty space in the register, an emptiness that spoke louder than 1,000 arguments. The landlady's sister, whose name had previously appeared in the papers, was slowly building a new life. She returned the silver spoons and 2 pieces of cloth from the pawn shop, agreed with the laundresses to do some part-time work at home, and for the first time in many seasons did something that seemed trivial, but was an honest gesture to herself. She bought not a tincture for headaches from the pharmacist, but simple soap and lye for washing other people's shirts. This purchase went into the pharmacy's notebook like other lines, without emotion, but it was important for the record. Reducing pain was no longer a matter of bubbles. It was becoming a matter of understandable deeds. Her cousin, who lived in the neighboring courtyard, took her sheet to the town hall, and the clerk carefully cut off the seal in front of her, threw it into a tiny cast-iron bowl, and melted it down with the others. At the end of the day, there was a common lump from which seals for bills were cast. The same mass of wax, but with a different meaning. Instead of stamping authority over the body, it stamped the accounting of debt. My husband's family, having hit a new wall, began to look for loopholes where control was weaker, in conversation and in fear. Instructions about manners began to appear more often, bypassing legal words but filled with meaningful pauses. In these places, the city machine cautiously but firmly brought out tools against rumors. In the Book of Fines, a separate column was created for damage to reputation by the threat of suspicion. It was not easy to use it. Evidence, a note, a sign of public humiliation were required, and it was this difficulty that protected against abuse. But the column itself dug a neat ditch under the myth. If something is difficult and requires proof, it loses the charm of universal agreement. Legends love what cannot be touched. A document forces you to reach out. The medical section of the Chronicle preserved an important line. The monastery doctor left notes about cases when sleep quickly returned to homes that had defended their right. Midwives recorded that some women no longer had bouts of unexplained tremors, which they had previously associated with the inevitability of family nights on days when fatigue was stronger than desire. These observations did not turn into festive reports because the Chronicle does not know how to sing hymns. They simply became part of the pulse of the document, coinciding with excerpts from the statute, just as heartbeats and footsteps on a flat pavement coincide. Sometimes these records were interspersed with heavy lines about trauma, cruelty, and crude attempts at coercion. The office added references to them: fines, mediation by the mayor, assistance from the district police officer. temporary shelter with relatives. The language remained dry, but dryness was a salvation here. In a place where it was easy to break into rhetorical hysteria, the paper kept its composure. Several times it seemed that the situation would be reversed. In early winter, in a neighboring quarter, a master blacksmith announced that order had been restored in his house and that no innovations would break ancient obedience. His words flew through the taverns like sparks from a coal pile. But when the neighborhood headman came to him with an extract from the penalty book, where a considerable fine had been imposed for previous expulsions from the city, and with a letter from the district governor about the non-transferability of consent, the sparks died out, like will-o'-the-wisps under wet snow. Nothing was broken, no one shouted, they just put the paper on the table, and the paper again proved heavier than habit. Somewhere in the background of this story, the persistent, unnoticed craft of young scribes was going on. They learned to distinguish between handwritings in order to catch recurring phrases, learned to bind collections so that the text would not fall apart, learned to count so that the numbers in the fines would be understandable to people. The bookbinding workshop smelled of paste, leather, and cinnabar. On the tables lay sheets of paper with words about dowries, debt terms, and the inviolability of bodily integrity. These words absorbed the smells, and perhaps that was what made them true. The law took on some of the daily burden that usually broke women's shoulders. The burden did not disappear, but it was distributed differently, like baskets on the shoulders of not one porter, but many. Not everything went smoothly. On the outskirts, a dispute arose as to whether a temporary loan from the chest could be considered voluntary if it was signed in the midst of debt. On this issue, the legal and economic lists converged, like two roads converging at an old bridge. The merchants decided that the loan would only be considered valid in the presence of the key-keeper in the office, and after an examination of the state of health, which must be certified by a doctor or midwife. Some found this decision ridiculous. Why bring herbs and ointments into it? But the point was different. The law recognized that exhaustion and fear distort the will, and placed a small mirror next to the signature, in which the hand, its tremor, and strength could be seen. Thus, medicine and law met on the narrow threshold of the chest and parted without stepping on each other's toes. Family trajectories, curled up in shame, slowly straightened out. The hostess's sister, seeing how the new student from the laundry was dizzy from the first days of hard work, taught her to change the rhythm of her tasks. Coarse linen in the morning, small darning in the afternoon, sorting in the evening. It was a small lesson in survival, unrelated to books, but the order of books created time and silence for her. Her cousin, weakened after a long winter, began to ask her neighbors for help with a crust of bread and a bucket of water, without feeling the former fear that the request would declare her disobedient. Reputation was no longer measured solely by silent endurance. It now included the ability to use text as an object of common use, like a bench against the wall that one could lean on. Several new marriage contracts were brought to the town hall, already with the usual clause about the non-transferability of consent. One of them caused a whisper. The bride and groom had written in a clause about joint duty at the stove on the night before a large order, with a clear limit and payment for apprentices. Someone called it strange poetry in a dry book, but the clerks left the clause untouched. There was no trap in it. It was a transparently formulated job. And the more transparent the job became, the more transparent the line between duty and violence became. In the silence of the office, it sounded like the smooth stroke of a needle on soft leather. Meanwhile, word spread along the trade routes that a dispute had broken out in two towns in the north over whether it was possible to include in contracts a spouse's obligation to keep the peace in exchange for a reduction in debt. It was decided that peace was a universal category, like air, and therefore could not be the subject of bargaining. If peace is broken, it is paid for with fines and labor. If it is preserved, no one gets a discount on someone else's will. This decision seemed utilitarian and perhaps dry, but its dryness was a virtue. It left no room for trading what cannot be traded. By summer, the city was in a different legal climate. Warm rains washed the cobblestones, and a new sheet was hung on the town hall wall, a set of short rules for powers of attorney. There were no grandiose titles or long paragraphs. A few lines about property, labor, and debts. A separate line stating that powers of attorney that replace living consent in matrimonial matters are null and void. It was pointed out that a seal is a sign of a registered document, and the absence of a seal is a reason for verification, not panic. Next to it, in a simple carved box, lay samples of seals so that anyone could touch them with their finger and see the difference. It was almost naive, but that is how forms are reinforced, through the repetition of simple gestures until the hand itself finds the right protrusion. Life in the tanner's house had imperceptibly changed the meaning of the word we. Previously, it meant a family inclined to sit with their broad backs to the fire. Now, it more often meant two adults who knew how to calculate an order, agree on shifts, carry water, and close the shutters. This we was not victorious. It was working. It did not eliminate quarrels and fatigue, but it deprived neighbors of their usual point of reference for oppressive glances. And when strangers walked down the street, the habit of looking for a sign of obedience or its absence disappeared from their eyes. They looked for the quality of the tanning and the price of the belt. Bargaining restored to the city the sobriety in which the law breathes deeply. The myth does not disappear, even if it is left without bread. It lives on crumbs, in dark corners, in stories on rainy evenings. But now, next to the myth, stood a bookshelf, within reach. And if whispers about the old days began in the house, there was always someone who reached for the shelf and pulled out a sheet with a seal. The sheet was silent. The lead on the string spoke for it, the account in the register, the dry figure of the fine paid last winter, the absence of new lines about night noises. Around this silent speech, a new habit was formed, rearranging the stools in the house so that it was comfortable for them to live together, rather than standing in formation to impress the yard. At the end of the season, a short entry was made in the town hall book. In the matter of full authority over family decisions, fulfilled, explained, repeated. These three verbs, without names and without emotion, were sufficient for the chronicle. They did not promise that there would be no more attempts. They promised that the city had a memory. This memory is not lofty or heroic, but accounting. It remembers sums, dates, formulas, the smell of wax, the weight of a lead seal, the rhythm of footsteps on the morning pavement. And when one autumn morning, fog hung over the market, and it seemed that once again it would be possible to hide someone else's will in it, people found the box with seal samples by touch, ran their fingers along the line that spoke of the indescribable nature of consent, and went on their way, some to the shop, some to the tanning pit, some to the bath stove. The city breathed as craftsmen breathe before a long day, evenly, without promises of the impossible, but with the confidence that the right tool was lying where it had been left yesterday. By the third season after the decision, the city had finally come to terms with the idea that limits are visible, not only on bridges and blacksmiths' horseshoes, but also in words. This idea did not come in a single day, and did not fit into a festive formula. It penetrated inside, like impregnation into leather, slowly and inevitably. The morning market sounded a little different. The barkers shouted as usual, but there were fewer foreign names and more goods in their cries. At the bathhouse gates, people stopped whispering about the family affairs of those who dared to bring papers to the town hall. At evening, gatherings at beer tables, The smug tone with which words about ancestral fortress had previously been uttered disappeared. Only two sounds stood out in this general noise: the tapping of a seal on the table and the dry rustle of a registry page being turned by a clerk. These two sounds became what spring bells at the fair had once been for people, a sign that life was going as it should. However, the shadow of the old myth lingered for a long time, and it knew its tricks. Several houses tried to revive the old scheme under new words. The papers became more cautious, like a beast that had sensed a trap. Now they wrote about reasonable regulation of family labor and the priority of a single voice in extraordinary circumstances. Nowhere in the text was there a crude demand for endless consent, but the meaning shone through every line like holes in a worn-out skin. Notaries and magistrates stopped letting such formulations pass. They asked for lists of extraordinary circumstances, evidence of the impossibility of a joint decision, and a doctor's note stating that the parties were capable of understanding the meaning of the document. The papers crumbled under these requirements. Those who wanted to be predatory did not like to speak specifically. Those who were used to exerting pressure did not know how to show evidence. The city books seemed to have learned a new reflex: to pull the document toward objectivity until the ghosts disappeared from it. Political power did not interfere openly, but its breath was felt like the cold from the stone walls of the fortress. The ruler, referred to in letters as Sigismund, still sat on the throne, and his office sent out collections of interpretations with a moderate but firm emphasis on the limits of legal capacity. These compilations were rewritten from time to time, and each new copyist used less reverential vermilion and more precise writing. The law seemed to lose its luxury and acquire a craftsmanship. When the next messenger brought additions with notes on the compliance of city norms with the imperial charter, the clerks wrote briefly, "Consent applies to matters of spirit and body. Therefore, it cannot be alienated. Attempts at substitution will be punished as abuse of form." This phrase did not sound like thunder. It was like an iron nail hammered into the wall, on which familiar things would later be hung. The economy also changed course. The moneylender who gave back the pawned spoons did not lose out. Her shop's reputation was strengthened, and people began to visit her more often, not because she was kinder, but because she was more understandable. Merchants who transported cloth and salt agreed tacitly not to accept items from marriage inventories as collateral without the owner's personal presence. Laundresses, laughing at the lofty words, did as they pleased. If a husband brought work and tried to speak with a single voice, they asked him to sit down and wait for the mistress. The conflict almost always dissolved after this request, just as the sharp smell of vinegar dissipates when you open a window. The most difficult cases were with tanners and blacksmiths, where there was noise and heat. But even there, a simple detail, a seal on the cord leading to the register, did more than long lectures. A visible sign of accountability calms even those who are used to raising their voices. Medical notes became more accurate. The doctor began to note two types of fatigue in his notebook, that from hard work and that from pressure. He did not invent science. He simply distinguished between where the heat of the furnace dries and where the tongue of a relative who utters old words every evening dries. Midwives noted that after dealing with powers of attorney, women rarely experienced night tremors and heaviness before dawn when they had to go to the washtub as if it were a trial, but from time to time, papers with distorted handwriting were still brought to the town hall, and they almost always had one detail in common. The signature was not made in the office, but at home, where men of the family were seen nearby. The office introduced a simple clause. Family documents signed outside the office required reconfirmation without witnesses from the family. This simple trick eliminated many home miracles. The breath and exhalation of the signature became more even within the town hall room than in the shadows of the kitchen. The old bathhouse guild, which used to consider itself the guardian of the physical world, unexpectedly became an ally of paper. A clause was added to their charter, stating that transactions between spouses concerning household payments did not affect personal will, and cases of domestic pressure would be recorded in the visitor log with the right to report them to the office. The log seemed ridiculous until the first inspection. When the priest compared the dates of night noises in the neighborhood with the nights when the bathhouse accepted women, it turned out that after serious quarrels, women came more often and stayed longer. These indirect statistics became the fourth pillar, alongside marriage forms, statutes, and medical records. The document was reinforced not by words about morality, but by the road dust of facts. The freelance clerk, who had survived a fine and training with another notary, seemed to have become a different person. He began to earn money by transcribing inventories, neatly, with careful spacing and accurate references. He no longer produced sheets that replaced consent. Once, he himself brought a strange document to the office that someone had tried to order from him. The sheet had a wax seal, the letters were beautiful and even, and the words were the same, about full authority in extraordinary circumstances, only rewritten more smoothly. The clerk refused, but left the sheet as a sample to be posted on the town hall door. It was a mistake in the myth, invisible to the crowd. Where it tried to come to life through someone else's hand, the hand grew tired from trembling. In a city where a person feeds on form, form feeds him in return, if there is no threat in it. The landlady's sister continued her quiet rise. She did simple but hard work for the laundresses in the evenings and helped the weaver tie knots during the day. Once she brought a neatly folded note to the town hall. She asked to certify a small agreement between neighbors to help each other in turn with the children from the doorstep and with water. The agreement contained 2 words that no one had ever demanded in such documents before: without coercion. These words cut into the parchment like a knife through cheese. The clerk who read the paper did not smile, but he placed the letter on top of the stack as a marker of a new norm. After all, if something is written where there is no dispute, it gradually begins to shed light on the disputed areas. Her husband's family finally lost their strong voice, but tried to hold on to their flesh. At the elder's memorial service, they staged the necessary theatrical ritual. The men sat on benches in a tight formation, and the women stood at the doors like shadows. A rumor spread throughout the city that following the magistrate's decision, a family on the neighboring street had broken up. However, by the next market day, the rumor had been dispelled because the broken family was sitting on a bench arguing about the price of salt, which in itself served as the best refutation. Nothing destroys a harmful legend like the visible everyday life of those it refers to. A new item appeared in the Book of Fines for spreading false rumors that harm the common good. It worked a couple of times, and things quieted down. By spring, a messenger arrived at the town hall with a letter from a distant district. There, papers with the convoluted formula of reasonable discipline of the spouse had been quietly introduced. The district court tried to tolerate them, but after a series of scandals, it turned to our magistrate for an expert opinion. The magistrates responded without arrogance, point by point. They pointed out the danger of the formula in the case of debts, reminded them of the local practice of seals and registers, emphasized that any mention of the transfer of the right to living consent was insignificant in terms of the statute, and attached excerpts from medical journals and bathhouse regulations as indirect evidence of harm. It was the quietest expansion of the correct form, without victory trumpets, without banners, through letters that intertwine cities no worse than roads. Letters refer, point out, are copied, and this slow copying forms a common field in which bad turnover loses air. In the town hall itself, The tone of the conversation became not softer, but more stubborn. At the next meeting, the counselors discussed which other words should be monitored. They decided that any paraphrases such as peace in the home at any cost, unanimity of duties, or sacrifice for the sake of the family would be placed on the table next to the already banned phrases so that the clerks would have a ready-made index. The head of the office placed a heavy box in the corner where all such clever sheets were stored and named this box without romance, Funds of Delusion. People came to see what was inside. They saw neat manuscripts with beautiful letter endings, and gradually a simple thought formed in their minds. Beautiful words do not make evil decent, just as fresh wax does not make an empty seal meaningful. Meanwhile, the tanner's house became a place where a new habit took root. The mistress and her husband, who never grew to love paper, accepted it as a protective wall, just as one accepts a stone fence around a drying yard. They argued as before, divided the work, got confused about deadlines, quarreled with their apprentices. But every time the argument reached the old line where threats began with the word duty, one of them remembered the plaque on the town hall wall. It did not make them saints, it made them townspeople. In cities like ours, holiness is not held in high esteem. Craftsmanship, measure, order, and respect for such a carnal thing as fatigue are held in high esteem. The memory of the city was recast into a stable order. In literacy classes at the school attached to the cathedral, boys and girls copied sample forms, and among them was a new one, short, dry, ending with the words, "Consent is an action, not a thing." The teacher explained clearly, action cannot be put in a chest like a spoon and given to someone else. It happens and goes away, and the next time it must happen again. These children did not yet know the severity of marital disputes, but they knew the weight of a bucket of water, and knew that water does not appear in a bucket forever from a one-time agreement with a well. When such an image is engraved in the mind, somewhere in the future there will be fewer cries in the night. The last holdouts tried to bring the dispute into the sermons. Several times, hints about order in the home and spousal responsibilities were heard from the pulpit. The parish cantor did not support this. He politely reminded everyone that instruction is not the same as action, and presented for review those very lines from the canonical collections where reciprocity stands like a measuring stick against the wall. Sermons began to speak again of the sin of stinginess, of pride, of laziness, of forgotten orphans, of things the church knows how to deal with. And when the subject of marriage came up, the cantor kept the rhythm every time. This was the thread that held the whole fabric of the new custom together. Outside the city walls, on the roads, this fabric was also felt. Travelers said that in some places in the counties, they were still looking for verbal tricks to suppress the will under the guise of habit, and that at fairs you could find papers similar to our banned ones. But now, our merchants and craftsmen had an easy, calm confidence in their answers. They showed the seal, talked about the register, named the notary, mentioned the letter from the governor's office with the interpretation, and the conversation deflated like a sack of flour from a small hole. The goods moved on. The dust of the road settled on the sturdy things, not on the slippery turns. Such an order is vulnerable to oblivion. If you stop touching the shelf with samples, if you remove the sheets from the town hall wall, if you stop teaching children to count not only beans and shillings, but also the steps of words. The merchants understood this. That is why every season, along with the inventory of barrels and measures, they made an inventory of formulas. They checked whether there was a sheet on the door about the non-transferability of consent, whether it was legible, whether it had been washed away by the rain, whether it had been rubbed off by the fingers that pointed at it. If the sheet faded, they hung a new one. It did not look like a gesture of a great idea, but like the habit of a good craftsman. See where the tool has lost its sharpness. Fix it. Do not wait until it breaks. Once upon a time, long ago, stone boundary markers were placed on the outskirts of our city, so that neighbors would not cross into each other's land. These markers still stand on sunny hills, covered with lichen, and beekeepers touch them with their hands as if they were icons. The paper posted on the town hall, the seal on the string, the entry in the register, the doctor's notebook, the column in the penalty book. These are the same boundary markers, only in the craftsmanship of life. They protect not the resentment of one or the arrogance of another, but the city's overall ability to work, breathe, trade, and sleep at night. And if ever another hand tries to write a beautiful formula about transferring someone else's will for peace in the house, that hand will stumble upon the cold stone of the text. The stone does not argue, it just stands there, and anyone who strikes it will learn that the city has not only ears and a tongue, but also bones. By the end of summer, the tanner's house smelled of fresh belts and the faint scent of pine needles from the new flooring in the drying rooms. The mistress went to the market with a basket and stopped at the town hall, not to pray or beg, but out of habit, to look at the sheet where a few lines marked the location of her house. Her husband lingered at the door of the bathhouse, where, on a board stained with steam, neat letters spelled out the hours for women and men and the fines for trespassing. The apprentices laughed in the shadows, swore quietly, pretending that the big words did not concern them. But each of them had already absorbed the simple truth. If someone brought home a piece of paper that did not belong in the register, it would not become heavier from the stamp. And perhaps it is precisely from such inconspicuous knowledge that the city survives its most difficult times. The denouement of this story is not like the striking of a bell or the sound of a victory trumpet. It is like the steady footsteps of people on the pavement in the early evening, when the first lamps light up at the town hall and the white sheets become visible again, like paving stones. The landlady's sister carries water. Her cousin stops by the apothecary's shop for soap. The moneylender counts her pennies and clicks her knuckles. The clerk leafs through the funds of delusion to lock the box at the end of the day. The shopkeepers check their lists again. And in each of these simple movements, the same meaning resounds that was written in black ink many months ago. Consent is action. The city is a measure. Myth is dust. A document is a stone. A stone does not save you from all misfortunes, but it prevents you from sinking into the quagmire where words turn into a whip. And while the rustling of pages and the tapping of seals can be heard in the square, it means that people have something to prop their doors from the inside, so that peace in the home is not bought by someone else's will, but is made up of work, rest, and the right to say yes, only when that yes lives on the tongue of the one to whom it belongs.